All right, we are live. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. This is actually my second talk today on this topic, so um,
Oh, okay.
it'll be interesting to see if I mix up what I remember I've said before versus now. But so you did a live stream with Vegan Power Lab, and I watched that, and that reaction was you guys talking about Alex O'Connor's most recent discussion on veganism for his AMA.
Yep,
Okay,
exactly.
yeah, and okay, and so I took some notes, and I just have some questions for you because I think a lot of people misunderstand Alex, and I kind of want to like help Alex decide with this. But before we get to that, I'm curious. What is your definition of veganism? Like when you call yourself a vegan, I know a lot of people will use like super old school definitions. Some people will
hmm
use a standard definition in the dictionary, but the majority of people use the Vegan Society definition. And I just wasn't sure if that's the one you use for yourself.
Um, well, so yeah, I guess, and you go by Carson, I'm guessing, right? Based on the tag,
Yes,
or
correct. Yeah.
okay. So if I remember it correctly, the Vegan Society definition is not using animal products or whatever as much as like practically possible, or as much as like what's practical, right? Which I think has a lot of holes. So, oh, thank you. Um,
Yeah. So,
yeah, I
veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practicable, all forms of animal exploitation, all forms of exploitation and cruelty to animals. And then the rest kind of doesn't matter. But yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
yeah, I mean the definition is decent. I do think that that portion, as far as is possible and practicable, I think that is really the flaw of this definition,
Mm,
because that can mean a lot of different things, right?
okay.
To a lot of different people. But yeah, I mean, for me, the where I come when it comes to veganism, or where I'm coming from when I say I'm vegan, I think that animal rights is a logical extension of human rights. So very similar to like the vegan gains definition. And I just reject all forms of exploitation to animals. I just don't know what that portion where it says as far as possible or practicable
So
means.
I think what people mean by that would be if a vegan was stranded on an island and they had to eat, if they knew they'd get survive or they'd get found in a certain amount of months, but they had a feeling that if they didn't eat some animals on that island, that they would die. That the practicable part would just essentially it's just saying it's necessary for whatever given situation.
Yeah, I think that where I'm coming from is, even if you're on an island, like I never find it justified or moral to take another individual's life, or violate another individual's rights for your own benefit. Now, that doesn't mean that I would necessarily, again, in that life and death situation, that doesn't mean I would necessarily judge others, or maybe, depending on how strong my will to live is, maybe I would cross my own morals or my own values. But there's a difference between like doing something that you're against because you are selfish and want to live that badly,
Mm-hmm.
versus like being okay, or like setting a precedent that, oh, um, exploitation or violating somebody's rights is okay in a survival situation.
Yeah,
If that
yeah,
makes sense.
definitely. Yeah, and like so if I go up to a random 5-year-old and break their pinky, I find that immoral. I think that's immoral. But if I was in a weird hypothetical situation where breaking a 5-year-old's pinky saved my wife's life, I would break that 5-year-old's pinky. I'd feel bad. It's immoral still, but I would commit that act because it seemed reasonable to me, even though immoral. Is that the basic idea of?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the action is still immoral. Like, you breaking a 5-year-old pinky is still messed up and still wrong, but you're willing to live with the wrong action, or you're willing to have that on your conscience to save your wife's life. Yeah,
Yeah,
essentially. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay, and I think I completely agree with that. We can each decide what we think of is a moral or an immoral act, and then we might not act upon it, but we still have that moral framework. So I think I'm not sure with most people with veganism if they probably view it somewhat like that. The thing I want to kind of get down to, because the thing that threw me off the most was your reaction to Alex saying in the video. I wrote it down. Alex said, if you're causing unnecessary suffering and death, and then you said veganism is not trying to prevent all suffering and death. And so I wasn't sure if you were referring to your own thoughts on veganism, or if you think that Alex is wrong even when it comes to the definition we see here that most vegans go by.
Yeah, no, I think Alex is wrong based on my own feelings and based on the definition.
Okay, so what I'm gathering is that he's just using a simpler word for people to understand instead of using practicable. So practicable is basically saying necessary. But another. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. No, you're fine.
I was just going to say, because the term, if you could repeat it also, but if I heard you correctly, he said that veganism is trying to reduce all unnecessary suffering to animals. And that's not what we're trying. That's not what veganism is, right?
So that was what you said in response, and that's the thing when it comes to doing live things and responses. It's hard to keep track of each word or whatever. So I mean, I probably make this mistake so many times. But when Alex said, when you're causing unnecessary suffering and death. So he's referring to the idea of someone causing it, whether you're putting it in demand or doing the action yourself, causing unnecessary. So unnecessary, like the practicable. So I think he's just fitting that definition.
Causing unnecessary suffering and death. Yeah, I guess it would be like the term causing. I guess we would have to kind of flesh that out because, for example, does growing crops cause suffering and death? Does growing crops for humans cause suffering and death? I guess, yeah, indirectly, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of like it's that whole idea that if you go and purchase beef and then you eat it, you're eating it isn't causing it in a sense. You're purchasing it is only causing it in a sense, but that sense is that you're putting it in demand. So same thing would go if there's no way to farm crops that vegans would eat without there being some death, then purchasing those crops is causing it by putting it in demand in the same way that purchasing the beef is causing it. The difference is the vegan crops that are causing some deaths are causing tiny amount of death versus a large amount of death. But I'd say in both cases, there's causing happening.
Well, but that's the thing is like, I don't think like for me, and based on this definition, I don't think it implies that veganism is not it's not about like the number of deaths, right? It's about the intentional exploitation and commodification of animals, right? So like, for example, if I'm on that desert island, right? And let's say it's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry. I meant to close out of that other screen and I closed out of you for a second, but.
Oh, no problem. So yeah, let's say I'm on that desert island and it's me and another individual, could be an animal, could be a human, whatever you want to go with. And there's only a finite amount of food, right? There's only a set amount of food. By me eating that food versus giving that food to that animal, right? Technically, yes, that animal will probably die in that process, but I did not violate that animal's rights, right? I took the resources that were available, right? So you could call it competition for resources or competing for survival. But I did not actually violate that animal's rights and kill them, right? They died indirectly because I took the resources, but I view those actions as two different things.
Okay. I do too, and I think that was a really good example. Can I give you a hypothetical?
Sure.
Okay. So let's say let's say someone, not you. Let's say Bob is in the forest and he has a gun, and there's an apple tree and it has an apple on it.
Mhm.
Let's say Bob loves apples. He really likes that apple. And Bob does not need food. He has an endless amount of food. He has his own farm, actually. He just has like crazy amount of food. He doesn't need any extra food, but
Mhm.
he loves apples, and specifically the apples in this forest. He goes to this forest. There's the apple tree with the apple on it, and a deer comes up, and a deer is about to eat that apple.
Mhm.
Bob pulls out his gun, kills the deer, so the deer doesn't eat the apple because he tries to scare the deer away, but it won't leave. It's just going to eat that apple. So he
Mhm.
shoots it. He kills the deer. Bob grabs the apple, eats the apple. He leaves the
Mhm.
deer, and he takes off. Is there an issue here? Is Bob doing a non-vegan action?
Yeah, I think the thing about this hypothetical, and I'll answer it, but I think the thing is in this hypothetical, we know that we know like the calculation of what is the exact amount of food we need for survival and what isn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're asking like if there was a way to calculate, because it's an empirical claim, right? If there was a way to calculate, okay, if we grow this amount of crops, this will feed exactly this amount of people and have exactly zero nutrient deficiencies, I would actually be for regulating crop production, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, for example, in this hypothetical, if what would you say, Bob was the guy's
Bob,
name or
yeah.
whatever? So, yeah, if Bob did not need the apple and knew, right, was able to calculate empirically or prove empirically that, okay, I have no nutrient deficiencies, I have all the food I need. Yeah, there's no reason to shoot that deer in the head to take the apple. Um,
Okay.
yeah, if that makes sense. Because
Yeah,
I
no.
think,
Mhm.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I like to use that example because I guess the same. It would be similar if Bob knew that deer would come to eat the apple, and Bob created a poison that would attract deer, and that would make when a deer consumes it, the deer, let's say, would die a miserable death, or it doesn't even need to be a miserable death. It can just be a death or whatever. And so we could swap that out and have it be where the deer, when it comes to the tree, so Bob's not even there. He just left the
Mhm.
poison, and some days no deer will come and no deers will be harmed, and Bob will just eat an apple. And then other days a deer will come, eat it, and die. And so the reason I like to use these examples is because when I first was discovering crop deaths, my first and only thoughts whatsoever was just the idea of dumb mice and snakes getting caught up in a tractor. And then I learned more about it. There's rodenticides. So because they'll know that certain rodents will come out and eat some of the harvest, they'll put rodenticides everywhere. And so we knowingly, to keep our products that we want to eat, we'll put these products out for mice to come. They eat and they die. And I think it's
Mhm.
complicated. The detail of it mattering, in my mind, would be on a scale depending on how much suffering there is from the rodenticide. Another thing is that like deer and elk will come and eat crops, and then farmers will have hunters come in and shoot the deer and elk so they won't eat the crop. And so
Mhm.
those two are what the analogy are trying to fit, and I think they're comparable.
Sure. I mean, again, like the biggest issue I have, Alex O'Connor, is like, because here's the thing: amongst vegans or amongst like, once we establish that okay, animals should not be exploited, bred into existence, killed for like essentially their body parts, right? Their flesh. Once we've
Mm-hmm.
established that, do I think that first of all, the crop agriculture system, like the industry, is well above my pay grade, right? I have no influence on that. But if I were to do research, and I have, like you said, I've learned about the crop deaths. Do I think that there are ways we could vastly improve upon the crop agriculture system we have? Yeah, I'm sure there are, or there are ways. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
just like with almost every other industry, right? Especially in a profit driven society or market or whatever you want to do, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, we have a lot of unnecessary products and a lot of things that actually aren't even beneficial for humans. They're there because people will pay for them, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of issues with the system we have. But when we're discussing veganism, in no way, like just because we have those imperfections in our system, in our, I would say it's more of a economical system. Um, in no way does that justify the exploitation of animals, right? And I
Correct.
think that the problem with Alex's case is, and I even listened earlier before we did before I came on stream, I was listening to the talk Alex O'Connor had on the Trigonometry Boys or whatever, Trigonometry podcast. And he does a great job of explaining the issues with factory farming, of explaining the issues with animal exploitation in general. The problem I have is he can clearly do a great job of arguing, but he is not aligning his morals with his actions, right? He's not a vegan. Mm-hmm. He's not, avoiding contributing to the animal agriculture system. And I don't see how that's justified, especially especially from the position that Alex O'Connor is in, where he has money, he has resources, he has time. So I just don't see how that could be justified at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on a lot of that. I made a note here that because you had mentioned that when Alex said him not being vegan is for practical reasons, and then you were saying that if he's doing it for practical reasons, then that's going to be factory farmed food. Like if he's just doing a speech and is just needs to grab food really quick, there's no way that quick food is going to be non-factory farmed. So I think that's a very good point you made. I agree with a lot of the things that you did say in the video, but I think there are some complications. Now, part of this is Alex's fault. I don't know if anybody owes anybody explanation, but I personally wish Alex would explain himself a little further, not just why he feels like he practically can't be a vegan, but also I want to know how not vegan he is. I think a lot of us view it as you're either vegan or you're not. And clearly we can see with what we're talking about with the cropland, where even though we can't be perfect, we can see that there's certain levels, like if somebody that just eats typical crops, that let's say one animal a year dies because of the amount of crops they eat, where somebody else grows their own crops, and because of that, one animal dies every 2 years. They're twice as good in a sense as far as their outcomes, not their intentions, but so there's no perfect way to do it, which is why I think when us vegans talk, we should focus on various areas of there's the worst you could do of anything, and then the best you could do, and all the in between. So in the same sense that I just wonder if Alex is like 99% vegan, or if he's like a lot of ex-vegans where they went from being vegan to just being a typical meat eater. Because if Alex is just eating like a couple simple products that happen to not bother his stomach, that say there's like a little dairy in it, which doesn't make sense because dairy would bother his stomach. But you know what I mean? Like if he's just not going out of his way to be a perfect vegan, and he's like eating like one egg a month or one piece of fish a month because he's been convinced that it would be good for his health, I think that's something that is worth respecting, because I would love to get all the meat eaters in the world to cut down to one egg a month and one fish a month, you know?
Well, I mean, again, I feel like you're viewing it from like a numbers comparison, right? Like, yes, to a certain extent, right? Like, for example, if I could snap my fingers and instead of having, 5,000 people die in car accidents, if I could have 2,500 people die in car accidents, if I could snap my finger and make that happen, yeah, I mean, I think if it was that simple and that easy, I think we ought to do that morally. But the amount of people dying, right? So like 10,000 people dying in car accidents versus 2,000. I don't think the more people dying makes driving cars any less or more moral, if that makes sense. So like, if an action that I'm doing, right, if my action is not directly exploiting or violating the rights of others, and it just so happens that this activity leads to, a lot of death, right? I don't find, like, if there was a way to reduce that death, that's great. I'm for it. But if there wasn't, I still wouldn't be against that action, right? I'm not against that. I'm not against the action of driving cars. I just would want there to be a way to reduce the amount of car accidents. But that doesn't mean that, car accidents or driving a car is immoral, if that makes sense. So I don't really like doing the numbers thing, because you could take that to an infinite level of what's unnecessary, right? Again, like if
Well,
there was a way, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just like the numbers must matter though, right? Like, so if one cow suffering
Mhm.
is better than two cows suffering, right?
Sure.
And so if let's say Alex could go to eating 10 units
Mhm.
of animal products a week, but Alex decides he went from being vegan to eating one or 2 units of animal products a week, versus what he could do if he wasn't thinking morally. He's going, okay, I can't do this anymore. I crave this thing and I've been convinced of this health thing, so I'm going to eat some of this, but because of my morals, I'm going to not eat these 10 units that I would eat if I didn't have the morals. I think those numbers must matter, right?
So, okay, like for example, a murderer who is totally fine with murdering, instead of killing 10 people in a week, he decides he's only going to kill 2 people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is better in terms
Yeah.
of like the individuals that are harmed, in terms of, the overall rights violations, whatever. But the actual lens that that person is viewing morality through and the actual actions that he's committing, while it's not as bad as it could be, I would still argue he's still committing rights violations. He's still doing something immoral based on my perspective or my values. Now, I think the issue here is like what I would want to ask you is like, yes, the numbers matter, but for example, if we knew that 500 people die a year from murders, but 20,000 people die a year from car accidents, would we ban driving cars and allow, like, would we prioritize reducing the car accidents, or would we prioritize punishing or reducing the murders?
Gotcha. Well, I think okay. So we definitely, like, as a society, we want to protect and we want to weigh out good versus bad. There's so many goods to driving that a
Yeah.
car accident's gonna not make us stop having that. If when people text and drive there were no accidents, then there would be no law against texting and driving. It'd be like somehow we're able to achieve this. And then same thing with murder. So we want to protect from murder. We want to feel like we are safe in our society. So we say you can't murder. If you murder, you're going to go to jail. So yeah, I would say yeah. Maybe this will answer the question. I don't know why I'm going about it in such a long way. With the trolley problem, I let the 5 die. I don't switch it over to the 1 track. Because yes, I view accidents very different than a rights violation. And for me, what matters most is the rights violation.
Right. So, and that's kind of my thing is like, when we're looking at the lens of, okay, the only death that or suffering that's occurring is through car accidents. Okay, how can we reduce this? What can we do? What regulation can we put in place? How can we minimize the car accident deaths from 20,000 to 10,000 to 5,000 to hopefully none, right? Mm-hmm. But when we're viewing it from, okay, there are thousands of people being murdered every year, and then there are thousands of people dying in car accidents every year, we should have laws and regulation and more protection against the intentional rights violations versus the car accidents or the indirect rights violations. We could call it that, right? So like when it comes to animal agriculture, like, yeah, again, I am actually, depending on the scenarios, again, I don't know who would be in charge of this, but I would actually be for, because I care about others. I would like to be more minimal. I value less suffering overall as well. I would be for different regulation for crop agriculture, for goods you could purchase at the store, for whatever you want to look at. But that number one, I don't think that could ever happen. Nobody is ever going to care about that when we have a system of direct animal exploitation, right?
Yeah. I agree with you that it's complicated because we can compare different things and one thing can be way worse than another. But just as far as trying to figure out if an action is bad, I have an apple tree in my backyard.
Mhm.
And I'm actually at the point where I don't have to fertilize it. I don't have to water it. It's something about trees. They happen to get enough water that they're fine, or at least this apple tree. Aside from something happening outside of my knowledge, there's zero, like I don't put out rodenticide for,
Mhm.
to save the apples from rats or anything. Zero harm is happening. If I pull an apple off that tree and I'm thinking about eating it and then I change my mind and I just toss it down, if I just throw it away, throw it down, it's going to compost and go back into the earth and do its thing. Did I do an immoral act by throwing that down?
I'm sorry, what are you throwing down again? Sorry, I
I'm
think I lost my voice.
throwing the apple away. Just apple. I picked off the tree. I was
Okay.
going to eat it, but I
So
changed my
instead of
mind.
eating it, you just put it on the ground?
I just throw it away. Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Now, if what if somebody purchases a vegan cake,
Mhm.
and as of now, I don't know of any cropland that doesn't involve some death. They purchase this vegan cake and they're going to eat it, but they go, change my mind. I don't want it. And they
Mhm.
throw it in the garbage. If we can calculate it and figure out whatever percentage of an animal died to get that vegan cake, even if it's 0.000, which would mean that at some point we can add it up, and if they just bought 10 vegan cakes, and we can ignore the idea of waste or the idea of plastic on the environment, anything like that. It's just the idea of putting something in demand, purchasing this item. It's a vegan item,
Mhm.
but throwing it away. Is that an immoral act if we put in demand a thing that is entailing animal death and then throwing it away?
No, I don't think so, because again, like, it's an empirical question. So like, okay, you would have to show that there are more crops grown specifically for the cake, right? Not just using the crops that were growing in like and dividing up the resources. But also, I always like this calculation where if there wasn't cropland there, right, there would be wildland, right?
Mhm.
And there is death and rights violations happening on wildland amongst animals, right? So you'd also have to show that there is more death. And again, if we're just talking about numbers, right, forget about intentional versus indirect, forget about veganism. Where if we're just talking about more death, less death is preferable. What's the calculation, or what's the evidence for that? So yeah, you'd have to show that there is less animals dying on wildland versus cropland. So that's one thing. So if we're talking about evidence you need to provide, that's some of it. But again, what was I going to say? You mentioned cake, throw it out.
I could respond to the wildlife thing, and then maybe it'll pop
Yeah,
into your
go
head.
for that. Yeah.
Okay. I used this analogy before, and if you don't like this one, I can switch over to a different one. But let's say some woman is in an alley, and there's 10 people that are gonna gang sexually assault her, and then somebody comes by and saves her, and they stop all those other guys, and
Mhm.
then they force a kiss on her and say, I'm just going to kiss you. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm just doing this because a really bad thing was about to happen, and that was stopped. So I'm doing this thing that's also bad, but nowhere near as bad. I think that analogy lines up well with this wildlife thing. I've never understood this when I hear Lifting Vegan Logic or Dr. Avi say it. I have not been convinced that there's any logical reasoning for this. And while you're pondering that analogy, I'll just give an extra detail to the wildlife analogy itself within itself. If I went out and found a piece of land that I could purchase for whatever reason that was like 10 acres, and there's a lot of wildlife death on there, suffering, whatever's naturally happening. If I could purchase that land, fence it off, and make it to where now there's no wildlife in it. So in that specific piece of land, it went from, let's say, 10 units of suffering to now 0 units of suffering. There's a chance that I could need that to grow food for my family or for a company or whatever. But let's say in this hypothetical, I don't need to, but I could. So it had 10 units of suffering from wildland, and I took it down to 0. If I turn that land into something that now causes more suffering, I don't have to compare it to the 10 units of suffering that happened before. Now I have to compare it to the 0 because that is an option as well. And so if I now go, I'm going to create vegan cakes that I'm only going to sell to people or give for free to people that don't need any food. I'm only going to give this to people that are at least 100 pounds overweight. Then let's say now there's 2 units of suffering on this land. 2 units is a lot less than 10, but there is suffering and death happening because of creating this thing. And the only justifiable reason in my own personal morals would be for health. Not that I'm saying somebody has to figure out how to be the perfect amount of health and they can't go a little bit over, but I would say that it's justifiable to figure out, to learn what healthiness is in your own mind or whatever, and try to be a certain amount of healthy. And if you honestly are going past that and you get overweight and you're consuming something just for taste pleasure, a vegan cake that, let's say we know that nothing in it is going to give you any nutrients you need, you're only consuming it for taste pleasure. I'm not saying people have to stop eating vegan cake, but it is going against, it is causing rights violations that aren't needed and not necessary.
Well, again, yeah. Let's go back a little bit. I will talk about the gang, thing and versus a kiss or whatever, right? So you are kind of the one who is putting a lot of weight on numbers, right? I'm not putting, like, again, my main concern, like, yes, it would be great if we can reduce the number of deaths or suffering, even in things that aren't direct exploitation or aren't direct rights violations, whatever. But in the case of that gang situation versus the kiss, you would actually, based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to strawman you, but it sounds like you would say, oh yeah, the kiss is better, right? Oh yeah, the kiss is better. And yeah, the kiss is better than what could have happened for sure, right? But again, I would say that a direct rights violation is still a direct rights violation. And in the case where it's, they're about to be, I guess my point was, right, if we're talking about numbers, then the amount of numbers that are involved on wildland versus the amount of numbers that are involved on cropland does matter, because you're not talking about direct rights violations. You're talking about the number of overall suffering and death that's caused by a certain circumstance.
Well, I'm only referring to rights violations myself. I'm unsure how we should handle suffering out in nature. That counter was just to the Dr. Avi lifting vegan logic idea of this is justifiable because of what the wildlife would have done. And I just don't think it is. And I think that's their claim. But yeah, I think numbers matter in a sense, but I'm only referring to numbers within rights violations.
So then I guess, what do you consider a rights violation, right? Because, for example, and again, I think that the number of animal death that's involved in crop production could be drastically reduced in a vegan worldview. Again, keep in mind, it's non-vegans that are farming that have created these systems. So I do think a lot of it would be drastically scaled down. But when we're talking about using resources, right? So, I mean, we could even equalize this, like we could put it with humans, right? We could look at it from humans. If there was a group of humans that could not be reasoned with, that had no ability to understand civilization or society, and every time that we, right, civilized humans, or humans that can't communicate, tried to grow crops to eat, right, to grow resource or use resources, if they kept coming over and kept destroying all the resources that we were using, or eating all our food, again, at that point, it is like an us versus them. And it's a matter of like, okay, they are taking all of the food that we are growing for ourselves, right? It's not like in a circumstance where we're dealing with other individuals that can be reasoned with, it would be simple enough to divide up the land, divide up the resources, move them here, move them there, like we do with humans to a certain extent. Obviously, I think there are issues with our system, but that's another conversation. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Let me counter it in two different ways. One that
Mhm.
means something to me, but one that just kind of challenges your own stance on the moral side of things.
Sure.
So let's look at something like people coming over to the Americas from Europe and seeing Native Americans there.
Mhm.
And if let's imagine that they were super friendly and said like, hey, we just want to come share this land with you,
Mhm.
and then the natives say no, and
Mhm.
then let's say that the Europeans say, oh well, we're going to. Who do you side with?
Well, I think in that scenario, they, like you said, they're able to communicate with each other. But in the scenario of like, what are you talking about? A hypothetical, or are you talking about what actually happened
Yeah,
with
let's say let's say they can't
colonizers?
communicate then.
So in that case, okay, so the colonizer, or the let's say the people from Spain, wherever they came from, they come over
Mhm.
to the land and they want to occupy portions of the land. And okay. Um so let me ask you this, just clarification on the hypothetical. So let's say
Yeah.
the people who are not native, right, native to the land, they come
Mhm.
over and they want to build shelter in a portion of the land, right?
Mhm.
Let's say, a 50th of the land or whatever. And every time they try and put up a house, the natives come and they destroy the house
Mhm.
over and over and over again, to the point where the people that have come onto that land, the new people that have come onto that land, will die if they are not able to build this house, right?
Correct.
I would say that in that case, they do have a right to defend their home, right? Their means for survival from the people that literally cannot communicate, cannot be reasoned with, and are jeopardizing their survival. Yeah. But one thing to add is like, when it comes to philosophical questions, I don't have all the answers. I don't
Mhm.
know what the justification for us living is, right? I did not ask to be brought into existence. So
Mhm.
like, again, like these like nitty gritty philosophical questions are really interesting, but
Mhm.
I don't have all the answers,
Oh, for
right?
sure. And I don't either. And I think the good thing about these, at least for me, because I find it interesting and I want to be the best human I can be and hopefully have conversations that can help others as well,
Mhm.
is just to further my stance. I learn new things every day. And so I think this is very comparable with the Native American thing. I just, I want to survive. I want to live. I would do anything to survive, but outside of that, I don't want to cause any harm. And
Mhm.
so, in the same sense that, like, the reason I mentioned the Native American thing is because it's actually an element that Alex says in the talk that you guys listened to, but it's actually the last little clip that you guys didn't listen to, which is basically saying. One interesting element is that we came to their land. So humans are taking land that it belongs to the animals, growing stuff, and then getting mad at the animals that are eating it. But me being a person that wants to survive, I will do that, and I will do exactly what you said, which is I will call it an immoral act that I feel like I need to do as a person that wants to survive.
Well, but here's the thing, right? When you say we came onto their land, we were all kind of brought into existence on the same land. So, like, when it comes to humans and animals, it's not like we were brought into existence on a totally separate land and are now like going to deer country or something. Like, we're all born in, forget about our modern society where we built cities and we've clearly took out a chunk and called it ours.
Mm-hmm.
When we were brought into existence, right? Let's say early humans, we were all brought, deers, all the other animals, humans, we were all brought onto the same plot of land, right?
Yeah.
So again, I think it comes down to reasoning and trying to create a more civilized society that does offer protection from rights violation.
Mm-hmm.
But with individuals that you literally can't be reasoned with and will continuously um, cause rights violations,
Mm-hmm.
I think it gets very muddy. Like, I don't think it's
Yeah.
as clear as animal agriculture.
I do agree that it gets muddy, but what I will say is that if we know, let's say that we empirically know
Mhm.
that all things that we purchase from stores that come from cropland entail death.
Mm-hmm.
Then there has to be, so again, the cakes. I use cake as an example because it's practically nutritionless. There's no nutrition to it. So you take a vegan
Sure.
cake. At some point, whether it's just one cake or if you say 10 cakes or 100 cakes, if you throw that away, you are putting in demand something that you are getting nothing out of
Mm-hmm.
that is entailing death. It's death caused by you putting it in demand. In the same sense that we'll tell somebody that says, "Oh, I'm not killing them. I'm just eating it. Somebody else butchered
Yeah.
the animal."
You're saying if we
I'm
have
not
the
saying your
empiric
action.
sport.
Well,
You're saying
I'm saying we do, but
you do have the empiric sport?
well, yes.
Can you so you can provide evidence that shows that for every extra, I don't know, for every extra piece of cake, there is X amount of animals dying.
I mean, I have to do a lot of math, but yeah, the numbers. I don't have it on hand, but the numbers exist for the average amount of deaths from cropland as far as each animal, like mice, rats, birds, whatever different thing, and then we could just divide and and figure out the numbers. I'm not saying we have the exact numbers, but I'm saying it's pretty safe to say that every piece of food that we can consume, how farms work now, will have this issue. And there will be a certain number. Like so when you consume the vegan food you consume, there is a number that exists no matter what. There must be a number that exists, whether we know the exact number or not. The exact number would be a silly 0.092 animals die a year because of logical consistencies, food consumption.
Sure.
Now, if you looked at exactly what you were going to eat for this year and then you doubled it, then however many animals would be harmed would be doubled. And so
well, I think we should view it from a calorie perspective, not a specific food. I think you're implying that the cake would, in the scenario we're eating cake, it's beyond our maintenance calories, right? So I think, we should view it because obviously if I eat 2,000 calories and 500 of it is coming from cake versus 2,000 calories and none of it's coming from cake, it's the same amount, right? So I'm assuming you mean eating more calories, right?
Yeah,
Because if I'm eating the same amount of calories, how would the food choices I make, unless, again, you can empirically show that, let's say corn results in more death than soy or whatever. You know what I mean?
There is that too, but I guess I'm going at an angle from causing harm, suffering, death for taste pleasure. I think that's the most logical argument I can see. The most reasonable argument for eating animals would be the argument of if it was healthy to eat animals, then that's the most justifiable reason. And so same thing with this, where if this crop death, the most unjustifiable reason would be taste pleasure alone.
Right, but if we're talking about numbers, we'd have to go off it from calories.
That might be the easiest route to go, and I don't know why I'm necessarily challenging that, but I do want to point out that if somebody's maintenance calories was 2,000 calories a day, and they got that from cake every day,
not all from cake. But what I'm saying is if I eat 2,000 calories of the least processed, let's say healthiest, whatever that means, but the healthiest food, plant-based foods, versus 2,000 calories of Oreos and bread or whatever, right? If we're just talking about the numbers of crop deaths, right, or deaths that calorie wise they would be equal, right? Unless again we looked at, okay, you're consuming this much soy and soy has more crop deaths compared to corn. But if we're just talking about generally, as long as calories are equal, the crop deaths should be equal. Right. So I think if we're talking
something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Because in Alex O'Connor's point, he's saying a bodybuilder because they require more calories.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And bodybuilding is not exercise for the minimum amount of exercise for health. It's after a certain goal for pleasure or whatever. Right. So that was his point. I think my biggest issue and why I find this, I like these conversations, but I think the reason why I get very frustrated with Alex O'Connor's position is because he is essentially trying to get into the nitty-gritty of existence, of crop deaths, of what's morally right when it comes to us using resources, taking resources away from animals, deaths that animal deaths because of our presence on the planet, essentially, while he is contradicting his own values, right? While he is not aligning his morals with his actions. And beyond that, while he is directly contributing to the rights violations of other individuals. And to answer your speculation or your question earlier, he does consume meat. He does consume animal flesh.
Okay.
The way I know that is because on the Trigonometry podcast, they said, so you went from like, how did you go from being a vegan to a meat eater? And Alex didn't correct them. He didn't provide any clarification. So we can assume based on that he does eat animal flesh. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I would be for, I try and be within a healthy weight. I try and be as minimal, as maybe not as I possibly could, right? Because again, we could take that to the tiniest amount where I'm, essentially a hermit in a cave. But separate from that, I do try and be mindful about how much I'm consuming. And I would be for better regulation to control crop production, to control all of these extra products and things that literally provide no value other than pleasure and profit for those companies. So I would actually be for more regulation there, but that in no way. So like preferences or like talking about what's better or worse in that context has, I think should have zero effect on the moral obligation that is to go vegan.
I mostly agree with you. I just think it's interesting to go down to each. Like, I would imagine that if we lived in a vegan world, the thing we're talking about now would become a huge deal. It would be the
probably.
new vegan. And I think that it's good for us to think outside the box and figure these things out. Like, the only downside to something like this is if it convinced people that were thinking about being vegan to go, oh, it's too complicated. Which is why I don't think an idea like this should be like sprung on somebody like, you're not vegan unless you do this, which is why I don't think in that kind of way anyways. Like, I'm a huge fan of focusing on welfare for animals while they're farmed until we can get the farming to stop. I'm a huge fan of stuff like advocating for Meatless Mondays, all these different things, because I think it's good to meet people where they're at, work on with people through baby steps and all these different things. But at the same sense that like getting somebody go from eating a lot of meat down to a little meat is good. Getting somebody that is vegan but 200 pounds overweight that eats vegan cake every day, they are literally putting in demand the unnecessary death of animals.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So let's say in a hypothetical, if more animals died from crop production versus animal agriculture, would you stop contributing to crop production and start contributing to animal agriculture?
I would call that the vegan thing to do.
Really?
The vegan.
Really?
Yeah.
So
if I had
okay.
a plate with a steak on it and a plate with apples on it, and I knew that the plate with the steak on it was 3 units of suffering and death, and the plate with the apples was 10 units of suffering and death, the vegan choice is to eat that steak.
Okay. So let me scale that up a little bit. So what you're saying is, if a system that breeds animals into existence, exploits them directly and kills them, had less suffering or less rights violations, let's say less overall death to make it easy, versus growing and protecting crops for human consumption, right? Where it's not a direct, like the goal is not to exploit animals or to treat animals as products, right? It's an indirect thing. You're saying that you would support the direct exploitation of animals and not support crop production.
Yes, I think they're both direct, but yes.
Okay, so let me put it in the human context. So let's say there is an industry that involves 1 million human deaths every year. Okay.
Okay.
And then there is factory farming of humans that only results in 100,000 human deaths per year. Are you saying that if you had to pick one, that you would actually support the industry that has 100,000 human deaths versus the industry that doesn't directly breed and kill animals, but has more human death overall? That's what you're saying?
Not human death overall, or even human suffering, which I care more about suffering, but the direct element of it is what I care about. If we were putting out poison for humans that would attract humans because we knew humans would be there, and we were just trying to kill the humans, so we basically my deer apple example, then yes, if in both cases there were humans being directly, intentionally killed, I would go for whichever one had less. Correct.
So you view that, like, let's say, what's a good example? Okay, so you view the, let's say, killing of an animal that cannot be reasoned with to protect human food supply the same amount of exploitation or the same amount of direct rights violation as breeding an animal into existence, treating them as products, and then slitting their throat for food.
It would be a measurement of suffering.
So
the answer is no. So if there's a cow that is bred into a factory farm and it's raised for 4 years in a tiny area, being fed garbage it's not supposed to be eating, and getting branded and getting dehorned and all these different things, the suffering level of that is going to be a lot more than the suffering level of a rat suffering from poison and dying. So I'd much rather the rat be shot with a gun and die instantly, and I'd much rather both of those cases than the situation with the cow. But would I rather somebody go shoot a deer in the forest and be such a perfect shot that it doesn't have any suffering at all, or would I rather a deer eat some deer poison and slowly die because that's what the farm calls for, but the farming is just for our vegan food? I would much rather the hunted deer than it would all come down to the suffering and maybe death, but mostly suffering.
Right. But again, first of all, you keep saying our vegan food. It's not just vegan. It's crops, right? Vegans are the only one that eat crops. But yes, like you're saying food compatible with veganism, I guess.
I only say our vegan food because what I am referring to is what we put in demand as vegan. So I would say we can exclude what non-vegans put in demand, I guess, if we want to. We can exclude the food that's being fed to animals because that's just not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the demand we're putting in the same way when we talk to animal eaters about the demand they're putting in.
Wait, I'm just confused. So are you talking about like only vegan cakes and stuff? Or are you talking about like soy, rice, whole food?
Oh, everything. I find it justifiable to want to live and therefore to poison rats so we can eat whole food to be healthy, and I'm going to do it. I'm not asking people to lay down their lives, but yes, I am talking about all of that. If we're talking about like the apples and the steak and which one I'm going to eat or which one's more vegan,
So when you say vegan food, you just mean food consumed by vegans?
Correct.
Okay, yeah. All right. I don't. Again, that's a very utilitarian perspective where you're only after like reducing suffering and maximizing well-being, which again, I don't really understand because
not maximizing well-being. Just for myself personally, I don't think of myself as utilitarian either. But so yeah, suffering matters to me.
You only put value on reducing suffering, not the well-being part, just reducing suffering.
Correct. Like I think it's morally wrong to cause suffering to someone, but I don't think anybody should feel morally obligated to go cause pleasure to anybody that like I don't think anybody needs to go out of their way to cause pleasure to a stranger. So as far as pleasure or well-being or any of that, unless you are causing the lack of well-being. But yeah, from my angle, the suffering is the bulk of what matters. How about you?
Yeah. So again, it's not for me. Like, yes, suffering I think is important to look at, but it's
Mhm.
ultimately about rights violations. Like, for example, maybe this is a better example with the human
Mhm.
context. Because again, my thing is I want to understand this from I want to make sure you're consistent with
Mhm.
what you're saying, right? So
Yeah.
maybe this may be a good example. I think it's better, a better example, but because when I said industry, I just said whatever industry, right? Let's say there's an industry that, like let's say sweatshop, okay? So sweatshop that pays workers almost nothing. The conditions are awful. The what's it called? Um, there's a lot of suffering. Let's say, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
suffering in that sweatshop. Um, but they do still get paid, and the products that they make are in accordance with the laws they have in that country. Let's just say, right?
Okay.
Um, versus there is a factory that, again, let's say they don't breed humans into existence. Let's say they just round them up and slit their throats for products, right? They're treated as products.
Mhm.
Um, in the scenario where there would be more suffering in the sweatshop, right? Even though those humans are still treated as humans, they
Mhm.
have individual freedoms. But there is overall more suffering in that sweatshop.
Mhm.
You're saying that you would rather support the factory farm
Mm.
because there is less overall suffering versus the sweatshop where there's more suffering.
No, no, no. And I guess I can see where you got that. So
But
first of
just really
all,
quick, sorry,
yeah,
I'll let you clarify, but just really quick,
yeah.
because earlier I thought you said that in the scenario where there is more suffering involved with crop agriculture and less
Mhm.
suffering involved with animal agriculture, you said the vegan thing to do, the right thing to do based on your
Mhm.
values, is to support the intentional, the exploitation and the factory farming.
If both were intentional, correct.
Okay, the sweatshop is intentional. What's
The
the
sweat.
sweatshop is
Okay,
intentional.
so the sweatshop. Okay, so somebody sets up a sweatshop,
Yeah.
and they're going to make it miserable to work there. But the people that go to work there, they feel obligated to work there because they need the money. But they are going on their own accord. They're going in. So I don't.
Oh, here's a better example. Sorry. So the sweatshop that we're talking about is producing food, right? Let's say they're producing food, right?
Okay.
And they're producing crops, right? Let's just say. And
Okay.
you need one or the other to survive. You either need to buy food from the sweatshop to survive, or you need to purchase food from the human factory farm to survive, right?
Hmm.
So in the sweatshop example, again, let's say in the factory farm, they're not bred, right? Let's say, right, they have their throat slit, right?
Okay.
As humane as possible, right?
Sure.
Um, so in this scenario where the sweatshop filled with humans that are producing food,
Hmm.
in the scenario where there is more suffering in the sweatshop of humans that are producing food, and again, this is an intentional sweatshop. This isn't accidental.
Hmm.
Somebody is intentionally making these humans suffer in the sweatshop. But um, the food they're producing is crops, right? It's whatever, right? So the sweatshop is producing food
Hmm.
versus a factory farm where humans are being rounded up and having their throats slit.
Hmm.
Would you prioritize not contributing to the factory farm that is having humans' throats slit and not offering protection to those humans, or would you prioritize not contributing to the sweatshop where there is more overall suffering, but those humans still have free will? They are not the products.
Hmm. Yeah. So very complicated. Very good question. Um, I'm trying to. There's so many different angles to look at it. So for
Sure.
one, I want to point out that when I say I care about suffering most, I am referring to rights violations. Now, suffering doesn't cover all rights violations, but I would say all rights violations would fall into suffering and death. which I care about both intentional causing.
So you're saying there can't be rights violations without suffering or death?
I don't think so.
Okay, so let's say there's a woman who has been given a drug and she's completely passed out in the back of a car, and this drug ensures that she's going to have no memory of this interaction. Would it be okay to take advantage and violate her bodily autonomy, even though there is no suffering and no death involved?
No, I'm certain enough that I'm going to call it a flat out no.
And what?
No,
But
that's
why?
a fair point.
Yeah, because if you're saying that your biggest thing about rights violations is just the suffering and the death, you're saying that if there's actions that don't involve suffering and don't involve death, then it's fine. But we can look at a lot of examples where that's not the case. And that's what I prioritize. Regardless of the amount of suffering, I prioritize extending rights, extending protections to those humans. If there is suffering happening to humans, to animals, separate from the direct rights violations, which again, we could debate on the crop protection or whatever. Yeah. But in a scenario where humans are treated, or animals are treated as products versus not being treated as products, I'm going to prioritize having the product mentality changed first. Of course, if we could do both at the same time, that's a totally different thing.
Yeah. Well, maybe. I don't know if they're necessarily comparable, but yes, correct. There are going to be some cases where the suffering, where it's not suffering or death, there are other violations. And I guess I was just lumping in the idea of like liberty itself in with suffering, because it's an element of suffering to not have liberty. But yeah, basically just, yeah, no, I agree with you on that stance. But let's, as far as the hypothetical goes, I'm trying to think of the elements I was thinking of that was making me figure out how hard of a time, because basically what I'm trying to figure out is my stance on most of this would be involved in what I think the government should do. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, if you have humans just living out in the wild, they haven't created a society yet. The reason we want to form a society is we get together and we realize, okay, we need protection. That's what we need. We don't need freedom. We're already out in the wild. We have freedom. Now we need to sacrifice a little freedom for protection. So we have this government that has law enforcement, and basically you're just told you can't physically harm people, you can't drug people, you can't kill people, you can't do all these things, and if you do, you're going to go to jail. And I think that's like the ultimate important thing of what a government's for. And I think we should extend those rights for the most part, unless there's some need for health, which I don't think there is. But if there were, then that would be an excuse for me. But outside of that, I think we should extend as much as possible those rights to animals, and that would be great. So when I look at this hypothetical, my first thoughts that are just coming to my mind are, how does the government view, imagining the government's okay with farming, killing, and eating humans, separately from that, not that they need to be consistent, but how do they view this idea of business? And so my first thought is trying to figure out what things I think a company should or should not be able to do as far as the individuals in there. But if the individuals come in on their own and they're only treated
bad, let's say in both scenarios they're mentally challenged. So let's say in this hypothetical world, mentally challenged individuals who can't communicate, can't understand anything, they that's how they're treated. Let's say that.
Okay, then yeah, I think unless I miss something, I think I definitely would go whichever one's causing the most suffering.
Really? Okay, so you're saying that in the sweatshop scenario where mentally challenged people they still have their like freedoms, right, as much as they can for what they can understand. You're saying that because there is more suffering from an individual perspective in the sweatshop, you would rather support the scenario where mentally challenged people are being factory farmed.
I think so, because the elements.
No, I don't know, man. Yeah, I don't know, man. That's
well. Let me just see if I fully figure you out.
Yeah.
Because the bulk. Do you care more about the suffering or the death? If we were just looking at those two,
I care more about rights violations. And again, like
Me too. Okay,
because
but better question. If you had two farms.
Yeah, notice how I didn't say the rights violations were equal. I said there
Mhm.
was more suffering in the sweatshop. Now,
Correct.
suffering can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There could be a lot of different ways to cause suffering, right? Like,
Yeah.
for example, I could be standing next to you and I could like be poking you in the cheek over and over again, right?
Mhm.
And yeah, that would be suffering. Am I violating a right? Maybe not. Or maybe like maybe I didn't touch you. Maybe I just have my finger right here, right? And I
Mhm.
did that for hours on end. You might go insane, right? It might cause a lot of suffering, but I'm not violating your right necessarily, right? So like in the sweatshop scenario, there's just more suffering, right? And it's suffering as a result of the people in like working in the sweatshop. But there are like there could be there's no specification on how many more rights violations there are, how many less rights violations there are. There's just more suffering. Whereas with the factory farm, we know that every person that is going in there is having their rights violated directly, right?
Okay.
Because go ahead.
I might not be answering your question accurately if I don't necessarily have all the information. Now I have the information you gave. If there are rights violations aside from the death and the suffering that I am not thinking about, that's worth going over. And I guess that element would be something like being forced to be there versus the people at the factory, the other factory, the work factory, going home. But I think one thing that we might be getting hung up on is my view on the difference between suffering and death. So just really quick, if you had two farms, Farm A and Farm B, and both of them bred a cow into existence, and one of them, Farm A, that cow is treated like a factory farmed cow, just getting all the horrible treatment, the horrible suffering, all that kind of stuff. And then you got Farm B, and that cow was just like, it didn't even know it was on a farm. It had so much room, all this grass and stuff. And then after 4 years, both are coming to an end. They're both going to be killed quickly and die or whatever. Do you view the death as worse or equal or whatever, the instant death? How do you compare that? Like, what do you think of as worse or not than 4 years of suffering? It might be better to compare pigs. I think they might have the worst life in factory farms.
So again, if I had to pick one, I would pick death only versus torture and death, right? Obviously, I think it's fair to say that, okay, if we have
what about
to pick,
death versus torture and life?
Versus torture and life.
So you got one pig that's living the greatest life ever. 4 years later, it just gets quickly executed. Or another pig that is factory farmed till it dies of natural causes, but it's crammed in this tiny cage. It's going mentally insane. Its brothers and sisters are biting its tail off, or it has to have their teeth clipped from birth. All basically the first 10 minutes of Dominion.
Well, again, I
life.
mean, that is an interesting question. I think, again, it comes down to rights violations. Like, I would say in both scenarios, their rights are being violated, and that's unjustified. If I had to pick one, I could pick what I would want for myself, right? I can't say that one of those is more moral or less moral. I would say that they're, in terms of rights violations, they're probably equal. Maybe
if you could put an intelligent brain inside the pigs and ask them what they would want, what do you think they would want?
I would say that if, again, going off of what I would choose, I would probably, if I did, like, again, because, if I didn't have any freedoms, if it was just torture, I would probably choose the have a great life and then die, or get killed, I guess. I'd probably choose that one. Go ahead, sir.
So I was just going to say, so I think even though it might seem extreme and you might think that we think extremely different, I don't know if we necessarily do. It's just really hard with this challenging hypothetical you gave, which is a really good hypothetical. It's just going to come down to a lot of the details. And
well, but again, like, yes, like, okay, like, what's it called? I guess the problem with viewing things from a suffering lens is it's very hard to understand what suffering means for every individual, right? Like, yes, we could generalize like, okay, keeping an animal or a human in a cage and depriving it of sunlight, like based on what we know on like what produces well-being, what people need for like mental health, for physical health. Yes, like we know that's going to cause a certain level of discomfort or suffering or whatever. But it's hard to calculate just based on suffering what situation is more moral or less moral. Like I'll give you an example. I watched something on the news the other day where this lady, I don't know if you saw it, it was on Instagram or something, but this woman was sent to jail because she was working with mentally challenged and mute kids. So these kids are mentally challenged and they're non-verbal, so they can't communicate anything. And on the bus, she would hit these kids. So she would like beat them, hit them. And these kids, if you look in the video, they don't really have any idea as to what's going on, right? So like they do have bruises, they do have marks on their body, but in the video, they're not crying, they can't communicate, right? So they're essentially taking this and just going about their day. It's hard to know, like in that scenario, like, okay, if you had a scenario where somebody who is, let's say, not mentally challenged and can communicate, right? Somebody in that scenario would probably suffer more than somebody who is mentally challenged and can't communicate, right? Just because of they're perceiving things at a lower level, or maybe their pain because of their cognition is lower or something. Who knows? Yes, the fully functioning or like the other group of people may be suffering more, but I would say that in both scenarios, the rights violation is equal, right? So like, I wouldn't like say, oh yeah, the rights violation for somebody who is suffering less is better or is like more preferable than the rights violation of somebody who can suffer more. They're both rights violations and they should both be given protections equally.
If there is a burning building and there are two humans in there and one, because of how cognitively impaired they were, was less able to suffer and everything else is equal, who would you save?
If my personal relationship to them was also equal, I'd probably save the higher functioning person if I had to pick.
Okay. I was just curious. It wasn't like a gotcha or anything, because I agree. But yeah, so I think one thing that makes it tricky with the comparing the humans in the situation that you have is with the farm, we are directly doing it. It's a thing that I think we both feel we have to do, but we are directly poisoning these rats and mice for our crops.
I guess that's where I get. Yeah, I think that's what I'm hung up on, because from my perspective, we're all born onto this land, right? Let's say we're all born onto this land, and these animals want resources. We want resources, right? Yep. And if there is a way for us to divide up this land and to reason with these other individuals, by all means, that would be my biggest advocate. That's what I would advocate for, separate from, veganism. But that there isn't that's not possible, right?
But why should we grow things on land? Like why should we? What's the reason that we could justify this?
Well, what's the alternative? So like, and that's what I was going to ask you.
No alternative. Just why should we justify it? Why should we justify it?
I mean, I think there is you could call it for survival, but I think there is a a healthy level of competition for survival or competition for resources, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
Survival, but why should we grow vegan cakes?
Well, separate from the cakes. I already said I was in favor of regulation, so separate from the cakes. I already mentioned at the very beginning I would be in favor of more regulation to try and minimize, right? But again, like.
But Alex is in favor of regulation, top down. Remember, so the
problem, the problem with Alex's position is that nobody is going to regulate if the people do not care. If you can point to any other social injustice or any other circumstance where there was top-down regulation when 98% of the population were in favor of not regulating, I would love to see that example, but that just doesn't exist. That's the thing. Like, if there could be regulation, top-down regulation, without people having to go vegan, yeah, I would want them to regulate it immediately. Who cares,
I think so too.
right? But that just doesn't happen because the people in the government, keep in mind, the people who are regulating are part of the population, right? If 98% of the population aren't in support of regulation, that also means that statistically, the people who are regulating are also not going to be in favor of it.
Yeah, and that's why it comes down to individual things. I'm not saying you should go out and tell all overweight vegans that they shouldn't be overweight or anything. Well, maybe I'm not. But as far
I think
as
there's a case for that, but yeah,
and that's basically all I'm saying. And I think Alex very well pointed out that the practicality was the reason he's not vegan. Separately, when it comes to philosophy, his some new thoughts, because he was asked new thoughts. It was just very specific that he was saying these are interesting thoughts, and I think that's very important to recognize that if somebody says that they go by the Vegan Society definition with the practicable, which would mean unless necessary, that an overweight person eating a piece of vegan cake, especially on a day that we'll say we know they got all their calories in that day, that they are causing harm. They are the cause. They are putting in demand the cause of harm that is unnecessary. And it's not that they shouldn't do it, because if removing all music somehow made less suffering, I don't know. I love music. I don't want or if I don't know if my house was half the size it was, if that caused the difference between one mouse dying or something. Like, I don't know. I'm not saying that we need to perfectly figure out everything in life it's either all perfect or nothing, but I'm saying we can look at individual situations and go, is this one reasonable? And if it is directly taste pleasure and not for human survival at all, that it wouldn't be fair to say that you are consistent with that Vegan Society definition if you're going to be overweight and eat that cake. I think we might agree, though.
I think there is a case to be made for minimalism, for reduction of or regulation of crop production, of calories, of products. Yes, I think there is a case to be made just for the betterment of everybody, right? If we can reduce the overall suffering. But again, I don't view like killing an animal on a desert island as the same rights violation as me taking food away from that animal, or me like for example,
but killing it for the food, that's different.
Well, so that's I was going to scale it, right? So if we're on a desert island, right, I'll go back to that example. And because we're talking about survival ultimately. So if we're on a desert island, I think there is a very big difference between viewing that animal as a resource for me to use and having to kill that animal. Let's say there's no other way. I can't fence it out. I can't scare it away. I can't keep it from eating keep them from eating my food, right? So the only way for me to eat the resource, or for me to use the resources on that island, was to kill that animal, let's say, right? I don't view those rights violations the same. I understand, like, from the animal's perspective, the animal is still getting killed, right? The animal may have an equal amount of suffering, right? Whether I use it as a product or I kill it to get resources, right? Or I kill it to prevent them from taking resources. Yeah. So from the animal's perspective, yes, they are dying in both scenarios. The suffering might be equal. But when we're talking about setting a precedent, when we're talking about setting how do we want the world to be morally, I don't think those rights violations are the same. And I would argue the same thing in the human perspective, right? If I'm on a desert island and I immediately look to the human and view them as a resource and slit their throat to eat their flesh, that's very different than me trying to do whatever I can to not kill that human. And then because that human can't be reasoned with and is eating all the resources on the island, I ultimately have to kill that human to get resources myself. I think that, that line is very clear.
No, I agree. And I think you would probably agree with me. Like, I'm not against the idea of somebody calling like poison control or whatever, not poison control, but
pest
having
control
pest control. Like if there are like ants getting into their cupboards, destroying their food, if there's rodents under their house chewing up and destroying their foundation, that we can't just say, okay, destroy our food and our shelter. We're going to take you out. And I'm fully on board for that, which is why my focus is on the unnecessary calories.
Yeah.
Which isn't easy to define, but yeah.
Yeah, I think if there was a way to empirically prove all of this and somebody did the work and somebody had the evidence, I think there is a case to be made for regulation and for like maybe vegans tightening up their calorie consumption or something like that. But I just haven't seen any empirical evidence. If there is, and I'm talking not just to you, but to the chat, obviously besides just speculation, right? We might be able to assume certain things. Like obviously if we have one field of crops versus two field of crops, yeah, maybe we're, blending up more rats in two fields versus one. Like we could assume things, but unless, there is clear evidence, I'm more or less agnostic as to whether or not like we need to tighten up our calorie consumption. And then even then, like, again, I don't think this should affect anybody going vegan. And that's my biggest issue with Alex O'Connor is that I
don't think he thinks that either.
Well, but here's the problem. Somebody asks, what has anything about your position with veganism changed? And he goes on to say factory farming, he pays lip service to factory farming, while, like I said, he almost certainly is contributing to it. And then he goes on to talk about a lot of like different scenarios, right? Whether it's crop deaths or bodybuilders or whatever. And continues to say, well, don't get me wrong, this is not a justification for what we do to animals or for factory farming. But when he brings that up and he himself is not vegan, again, I think he's really muddying the waters and making it incredibly confusing, right? Because he's not aligning his actions with his own values. He is contributing to, again, direct exploitation, abuse, and death of animals, or I should say murder of animals. And at the same time, he's being like, well, I've been thinking about vegan bodybuilders. It's like, the whole thing seems very philosophically dishonest. I think that he's trying to find philosophical loopholes because he's educated, because he knows he's very good with like talking and philosophy.
I'd argue that it's very specifically only philosophically honest. It's not honest within action or practicability. But I think it's fair to be a person that you might do a certain action, but you could state, kind of like we were talking about earlier, we could say this is moral or immoral, but this is what our action's going to be for this reason. It's immoral to break a finger, but I would break a finger to save this other person's life. And your actions won't fit with your morals, but and that's a bad example because that's extra justified, where Alex's animal eating probably isn't justified.
And what I mean by philosophically dishonest, I don't mean like, again, I don't know. I'm not the best when it comes to philosophy. What I mean is it seems like he's using philosophy as a way to be dishonest, right? Because it sounds like he is saying as though like what it sounds like is he's framing it in a way that because of these new thoughts, because of this new these new questions, that's changing his position on veganism. Where in reality, again, and I stand by this, I think that he couldn't do it, right? Whether it's convenience, whether it's whatever practical things he had going on. And now he's thinking about, okay, what about these other questions? So maybe my position is more justified. You know, if that makes sense. Because
Mhm.
and like you, to your point, he has never actually went in detail on what practically or practicably what issues he had. He just
Yeah.
hasn't. And I think he hasn't done that because he knows that whatever it is, there's a fix for it. There's like a workaround. And I
Mhm.
think it's
Yeah.
just stupid. I don't know.
Well, it's tricky because sometimes we might know something's a right thing to do, but because of how life is and easy conveniences, we don't. Like, I don't know a lot about recycling, environment, plastic, and whatnot, but I have a pretty good hunch that less plastic equals better. And
Mhm.
I usually make my own coffee, but there are some days where I might swing by a Starbucks to get my nitro cold brew, and it'll be in a plastic cup. If I have this guy with me, I'll just have him put it in my cup. But it doesn't mean that I can't say like, oh, I think if people cut back on using plastic cups, or if everybody used half the amount they use. And so same thing could go for all kinds of different things where I might make some claim about something not being the best route to go, but then just due to daily life and issues, we're not going to do it perfectly. And so with Alex, I would say that what he's doing is likely, especially if it's just for practical reasons and just being easier to grab a certain food that he likes the taste of, especially if it's taste pleasure, is worse than somebody that's overweight eating a vegan cake. But I'd say the same thing would come down to that, which I know you agree with in a big way. But I imagine somebody, a vegan version of Alex that stopped eating vegan cakes and overeating food because they recognize that even though it's not doing a lot of harm, it is killing animals. That if after thinking about it a while, they go like, I've decided for practical reasons, I'm actually like, it makes me happy to eat cake. So I'm going to eat one extra piece of cake every single day. And then it would be this complicated thing of, do we call this person bad or not? Do we call Alex bad? And I don't like to view people exactly in that lens. I like to just analyze what I think is right or wrong or achievable. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting conversation. Like, I guess at the end of the day, like, I think, like I mentioned, I think there is a very firm line between using other sentient beings as resources versus using resources and it affecting other sentient beings, right? I think that's ultimately, we're talking about crop deaths versus animal agriculture. That's ultimately the line is like, again, one scenario, we are using sentient beings, or we are creating a worldview where sentient beings are resources, are products. And in the other one, because of our presence on the planet, sentient beings are affected, right? But again, I would say that it's a very firm line between the two. If I could minimize my effect on other sentient beings, including humans, I would love to, right? I would, if there are ways that I can do that and still have what I need in terms of mental health, physical health, whatever, I would love to come up with ways to do that. I would love to have more regulation, stuff like, I'd be open for that. But again, I don't view having a presence on the planet and that affecting other animals as the same kind of rights violation or the same kind of moral issue as treating those sentient individuals as products, right? Commodifying them, exploiting them, breeding them, whatever. And I thought about this the other day too, which I guess we could talk about now. Because whenever I talk, and I'll speak for myself because I do a lot of activism, whenever I talk about, animal suffering or animal exploitation or animal death or killing, murder, whatever, people love to bring up crop deaths, right? Well, vegans kill animals too, right? Or vegans, crop production results in animals being killed as well. I always find that interesting how nobody makes that same argument for building homes or building roads or doing anything with infrastructure, because it's only when it comes to crops. But if we're going to make the argument that, okay, crop production leads to animals being killed, so does infrastructure building. So do
Mm-hmm.
building roads. So does building homes, building whatever, right? Anytime where we have to build on the land, we've got to clear the whole land out. We've got to destroy kill everything there. We've got to build up. And then again, people usually use pest control or use some kind of pesticide or to keep animals away.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, nobody is going around, which maybe from your perspective they should, but nobody is going around saying, okay, no more building homes, or hey, no, or like saying like, hey, animals die because of the home that you're in. So why don't we? So who cares about animals dying in other circumstances, right? Nobody does that for homes, but they do that for crop production, and I don't understand why. Because to me, it's the same thing. To me, we are. Would you agree that it's crop production?
Well, yeah, because I think most people doing that are not vegans that are just trying to shut it out. Most people don't want to be thought of as bad guys. So even if you don't challenge them with vegan ideas, if they just hear of a vegan existing, they think that means that if that vegan is correct, then they're the bad guy. So they're coming up with the, well, you kill animals on crops or whatever, which is probably why it's so challenging for vegans to hear other vegans talk about crop deaths. I completely agree with you. And I think that it's worth us figuring out all those different things and figuring out why we feel how we feel and what things fall into those categories.
Yeah.
I think I've decided for myself that I think taste pleasure is not a good enough reason to harm an animal. But I don't think the fact that we could accidentally step on an ant means that we shouldn't leave our house. I think that because roads and cars are important, that we should keep using cars. But I think it's not fair that a deer that has no idea what a car is going to get hit by a car. So us humans should figure out how to fence them off into the wildlife better. Squirrels, if we try everything we can, but we can't keep them out of getting hit by cars, then that's going to be kind of like the ants. And so we have to look at all these different things. I don't have a strong stance on if we need to equally share land with various animals. So if we take up land and therefore animals can't be on that land, I don't have a strong stance against it. I don't have a love for the existence of animals. When people hear like a certain type of animal might go extinct, it's kind of a weird idea. It feels weird that they might be extinct. I don't care if an animal is extinct. If every animal on Earth just magically disappeared, aside from that it's cool to see them and they're kind of cute or whatever, if they just magically disappeared and they didn't affect the ecosystem, it wouldn't bother me. But like you, I care about the rights violations. I care about the harm being done to them. I don't like the idea of them being trapped into an area. I don't like the idea of them being harmed in any way. If you poke them, they bleed, they whine. We have pretty solid scientific evidence that they are sentient and can feel. And so I don't think we should do these things. So if we find out that we can survive perfectly fine in a certain size house versus another size house, if it's not reasonable to downsize your house because of how plots of land sell, then sure, it's not going to be an easy thing to do. But every time that we discover that an action of ours that is easy to do would cause less harm, hell yeah, I think we should focus on that and try to create legal change in the future for that as well.
Yeah, no, I would agree with like I said, like you said, mostly what you're saying. I think there is a case to be made where when we can demonstrate that there is more harm being caused, whether it's again, because of our presence, right? Even if it's not not treating the animals like products or exploitation, but because of our presence, there's more animals being harmed. I think if there's a way to reduce that, I would be for that. I think there's empirical evidence and there's a way to, there's solutions to that problem. Yeah, I would definitely be for that, because I, like you, sound like want to cause less harm, or want there to be less harm on the planet overall. Like if I had a choice, like I said, if I could snap my fingers and have 2,500 people die instead of 5,000 people die from car accidents, I would. I prefer that overall. But yeah, so yeah, I think I agree with most of that. I think we draw, similar lines. I think your line, I think you are more focused on the suffering. Whereas for me, like, again, on that line, if there's one scenario where individuals are the resource, are the product, are given no rights, but there's less suffering, versus the other line where they are given rights, they are being affected because of human presence on the planet, whether it's homes, crops, whatever, but there's more suffering. I would still view the moral obligation as, or I would still view it as a moral obligation to prevent or to stop the direct use, the direct rights violations of animals versus them being affected by our presence. That would be I would say, you know what, if there's a way to reduce this, let's try and do that, because overall less suffering, overall less death is better based on my values.
Gotcha. Let me ask you one more question. Well, so one thing, my buddy Michael, who I talked to earlier on this topic, he said he would love to chat with you about the empirics of the crop issue. And that'd be a really cool talk. I think maybe the three of us should just have that talk. But also, there are some comments in here that people were asking about my vegan status, and I just wanted to comment on it really quick because I saw something about meat eater stuff. I think the main thing that's being said in here is referring to my eating of bivalves. Do you have a stance on bivalves, like a short?
I'm agnostic. Yeah. Okay. So I do not want to consume any animals. I don't want to use animals as resources at all. Now, again, I'm agnostic. I would love to see evidence. I've seen good evidence that they may be sentient. I know 2AM Vegan, when he was active, or when they were active, they did a great video on how bivalves are most likely sentient. But I've also heard a lot of people imply because they have such a basic nervous system or basic brain structure that they aren't. So I'm agnostic. I want to apply the precautionary principle as much as possible.
Yeah, fair enough. And I don't eat them often. I actually don't find the taste to be enjoyable at all. But I'm kind of agnostic as well, but I lean towards until I get the information, I'm not too worried, especially considering how much suffering there is elsewhere. So there's that. And then the other thing that some people might be referring to, which was mentioned for the first time yesterday, was about 4 months ago, I got some health news, basically my blood levels, my LDL levels, and some various different things involving heart stuff. Not connected to veganism, but just connected to being overweight at the time. I actually lost a lot of weight since then, like 4 months ago. But anyways, the doctor told me by the time I'm 45, I'll have a heart attack if I don't change my diet drastically. I'm 38 right now. And, but mostly it was just eating unhealthy garbage. And, but on my search for, eating well, I decided that I was basically just going to eat, the healthiest whole foods there are. I eat 2 cups of kale every day. I eat a cup of berries every day. But I dabbled in a little of fish products, during those couple months of figuring out, because it kept coming up no matter where I was looking, the health benefits of fish. And so I had salmon a couple times, and I had sardines once. I didn't like the taste of any of it. I didn't feel morally fine with any of it. Not that I am too familiar with the studies on it, but I feel pretty certain that fish are sentient, and I'm not in favor of consuming them, but I do care more about health than I care about animals. But I also don't know if I ever plan on consuming a fish ever again. And so I've been, aside from bivalves, fully vegan for over 9 years now. And then because of a health scare, I dabbled in a little fish, and I don't know if I'm going to ever have fish again. But my morals are where they are, and I have no interest in going like, oh, because I had this fish, I'm going to start eating cows and chickens or whatever. So anyways, it's perfectly fine for somebody to call me not vegan or only have been vegan for a month or something instead of 9 years if they want. But for me, talks like these and spreading the messages about moral and good actions that we humans should do is what it's about. So I don't mind the fact that somebody knows that I consumed little fish. Anyways,
No, and transparency is important. Like I definitely would view that as not vegan, but I appreciate the honesty. Obviously, considering you are on YouTube, and yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, from what I've seen of your content, I think I watched your debate with Vegan Gains. I watched it a long time ago, so I don't exactly remember, but you do. It seems like at least you are on more of the side of like reducitarianism, welfareism. A lot of your arguments are leaning in that direction, and I get from what I understand, and again, correct me if I mischaracterize your position or something, but I get that from your perspective, you think that is a better way of reducing rights violations or appealing to more people who could then reduce their consumption, which then ultimately is better, I guess, better than it would be, if they were full on consuming. So I kind of get that. I do think the message has to be kind of all or nothing. And then how people reduce, we could help people with tips to reduce, tips to eliminate products, tips to transition. But I think the message should be all or nothing. So, but yeah, and I mean, health scare, I mean, I always say like, if eating animal products extended your life, I would still say it's immoral. But obviously preventing a heart attack at 45, that I can understand the panic there that you may have been feeling. But as somebody who knows nutrition decently well, I would say that there is nothing in animal products that you should be consuming or would help you with your heart issue. In fact, I would say that fish probably is not going to help the LDL issue, because especially if it's like fattier fish. I would say that, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and eating things lower in saturated fat, trying to get that saturated fat intake as low as possible. That would help your LDL, unless you have like a genetic thing. But again, I'm not a doctor, so don't take any advice.
For sure. Well, it was actually pretty cool. So my LDL, I don't know if you're familiar with LDL too much, but it was at 212, which anything over 2 is considered scary. And
wow, LDL was at 212. Yeah, no, that's high. Yeah, that's crazy.
And in 3 months, because I had my blood tested 3 months later, I essentially, are you familiar with Brian Johnson?
The guy who's trying to reverse age or whatever.
That guy,
yeah.
Yeah, who happens to be vegan, which is pretty cool. But anyways, I essentially, without knowing, but later found out about him, doing my health research, I formed a diet of food that I ate the exact same meals every single day for that 3 months, basically, aside from the little dabbling with the fish I talked about. And it ended up being almost the exact same diet as him. So it was like
he does like the smoothie and then like the vegetables and like kale and stuff.
Yeah, and I don't do it all blended up like him, but yeah, also I'll make my own thing with like lentils and kale and all these different things, and it'll be the exact same calories, exact same food, same thing every single day. And anyways, I got my LDL down from 212 to 101.
Nice.
And the doctor said he had never seen that in his entire practice. I don't think it was because of the fish or anything. And anyways, not that
I can almost assure you, again, I'm not, there's no way for this is speculation, but I would speculate that it's absolutely not to do with the fish. I mean, if you go from eating more processed foods higher in saturated fat, which I'm assuming to get your LDL over 200 had to be the case.
I mean, I was eating vegan donuts, vegan cakes. Impossible Burgers, nonstop.
Yeah, and a lot of them use coconut oil, which is super high in saturated fat. So going from that to more whole foods to a diet lower in saturated fat, that would be like my biggest advice, regardless of like processed food, whole food, whatever. My biggest like thing or what I try and go off of, and again, not a trained professional, so don't take it's not medical advice, but what I go off of is low sodium, low saturated fat intake. From there, like the amount of sugar I consume, because I'm at a healthy weight, it doesn't really concern me too much. How processed the food is doesn't really concern me too much. It's really low sodium, or like a healthy amount of sodium, and low saturated fat, like as low as I could get it. That's really my only concern. And that should help with our number one killer at the very least. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And maybe we can talk about health at a different time too. But the last question I did want to ask you, aside from those couple notes, was might be a hard hypothetical to answer, but just as far as rights violations go, let's say somebody was in the forest and they were wanting to build a shelter and just live in the forest, and every tree in that forest had an animal living in it. Like you could just see, like whether it was birds or squirrels or whatever. Whether they just popped out to do Disney princess style, like chirping that they lived there, every tree had an animal living in it. Do you think so when you look at rights violations, it's kind of hard to look at like property rights because that's more of
yeah.
a man-made thing. But how would you view like a natural property rights of sorts, where if somebody wanted to cut down a tree and build a house out of that tree, or let's say somehow they magically had the stuff to build it, that they didn't need to cut down the tree to build, but they needed to cut down it to use that spot or something. Do you view the human need for shelter because humans could know that they'd be less likely to die from storms or whatever, to where if you're doing it for this extreme need, and even though it's an immoral act, would you personally find it justified to cut down that tree?
Yeah, again, it gets tricky because when we're talking about individuals who cannot be reasoned with, right? We're not even talking about killing those animals. We're talking about taking essentially their home and having them relocate, I guess, in this example, maybe. But yeah, I put it in the human perspective, right? Let's say there is a human who is living in a home on a piece of land. That land, they have no way of comprehending property rights. They have no way of communicating or reasoning. And again, in our society, we find it beneficial for the vast majority of people to have a concept of property rights, to have a concept of rights in general. So that way we're civilized, so that way we can make deals, trade, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So in that scenario where somebody had, let's say, purchased or acquired the rights to that land, and again, there's no way for them to like move them out or, reason with them or anything. That person is staying there. I mean, again, it gets tricky. I would say that to just, make that person homeless or potentially kill them is messed up. Like, I wish that didn't have to happen. But at the end of the day, again, we have a concept of property rights. We have systems in place. I don't see it as a moral obligation for the person to not build their home on that land and make that person homeless. I do think it would be preferable if there was a way for them not to, or like it would be great if they could both live on that land. But yeah, I think in that scenario, same with the animal case, I would say that because the animal isn't the resource, right? I don't think we are violating those animals' rights because those animals have no concept of property rights. They don't have, so I would say that that's kind of where I land on that.
Yeah. Gotcha. That's a cool answer. Awesome. Well, thanks for chatting. Sorry I kept you so long, and let's set up another talk because I think we both like the idea of challenging each other's stances to the point where we can pinpoint it the best as possible. So.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting conversation. And if you have any other, prompts or propositions, yeah, definitely reach out and definitely, take it easy on the vegan cake. All right. For your LDL and for what we discussed here. So, but yeah, thanks for having me, Carson. This is cool. And thanks to everybody who's watching or whatever. So yeah.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. Take care, man.
You too, man.